everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Vicki Fouts, and I'm the director of the Uprooting Racism Project. And I wish to thank the African American Museum for letting us use their space today and for being one of our co-sponsors. And thanks to Julia Dudley-Nagy for getting the museum for us. We really appreciate that. We also wish to thank all of our co-sponsors, the Interfaith Social Justice Collaborative, National Network in Action, CSU Fresno Central Valley Cultural Heritage Institute, CSUF's African American Indian Studies Program, and the Women's Studies Department, and Valley Black Talk. Also, thanks to our two facilitators today who are Uprooting Racism members. We have Aileen Reed and Dr. Jan Slagder. Let me give you some background on Uprooting Racism Project. It grew out of a book discussion in 2006 using the book Uprooting Racism, How White People Can Work for Racial Justice by Paul Cavell, sponsored by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. We received a racial justice grant from National WILF and received additional funding from the local Fresno branch of WILF. In December, I became the national chair of WILF's racial justice group, Building a Beloved Community. So this all works together. The Uprooting Racism book discussion was facilitated by Fresno State's National Coalition Building Institute, which puts on prejudice reduction workshops. And there's handouts in the back over there of their next two workshops if you're interested. Our group consisted of 43 women. About half of them were WILF members and about half were community members. About half were white women and about half were women of color. After we finished the book discussion over several months, we decided we wanted to stay together as a group. And so the Uprooting Racism Project was born. Our mission is to uproot racism on a personal, institutional, and systemic level in the Fresno area. We hope to be able to provide more information and training in the future. And then lastly, we also have white wristbands that read "My White Privilege." And these are really helpful when I'm in a group to sit and look down at this and remember my white privilege and how I behave in a situation. And it's also a good conversation starter, to explain to people what white privilege is and to explain to them what the White Uprooting Racism Project is.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. It's so good to see a good turnout. And the way we decided to break this down, we're going to view the film first. Tim Wise is quite a guy. I'm not going to paint any picture for you so you can see for yourself. And then what's going to happen afterwards, we're probably going to ask for just a few minutes to get your reaction to the film, your feelings, your thoughts. And then we're going to break down into groups, small groups, discussion groups. And that's going to go on for the last hour of the event.
Thank you. Welcome. Any other questions or comments before we start?
I want to start off by telling you that I think it is probably a good idea, and I try to give this advice at most of my talks. It's probably a very good idea when somebody stands in front of you and is proclaimed by virtue of their bio and by virtue of their curriculum vitae, their resume, that part of which is read to you, by way of the nice comments made about them by others, proclaimed to be an expert. It's probably a very good idea to ask yourself why it is that you're listening to that person and not somebody else. In this culture, we are led to believe that if someone stands before you, a proclaimed expert, that it must be because they are indeed the brightest bulb in the box, that they know something that the other people don't know. I am not standing in front of you, and you are not listening to me because I am the most informed person in the country on racism or white privilege, not because I'm the best speaker on those subjects. I'm fairly good, and I intend to demonstrate that to you amply in the next hour. It is not because I'm the best writer on the subject, though I am okay with that as well. It is instead because I, and I know this, fit the aesthetic that is needed on too many campuses and too many communities around the country in order to come in and to give this talk. Nothing that I am going to say tonight, or at least very little, originated in my head. Nothing, or at least very little, of what I say tonight is in fact new. Almost every single thing that I'm going to say this evening is wisdom that has been shared with me either patiently or sometimes not so patiently by people of color who have in almost every instance forgotten more about the subjects of racism and white privilege since breakfast yesterday than I will likely ever know, and yet they will not be asked to give 85 engagements around the country this year or next on this subject. Not because they have not the wisdom to do it, but because privilege, the subject that I'll deal with tonight, bestows upon me that advantage. And so as a matter of responsibility and accountability, I have to own that up front, so that when you go away from this evening thinking to yourself, my goodness, that was good. And I'm sure that's my subliminal way to tell you, you're going to think it's just great. And when you go away from here thinking that I have filled your heads with all this great knowledge and wisdom, please know that it is not mine. And the next time you hear it from a person of color, the next time it is shared with you, for those in the audience particularly who are white, the next time it is shared with you by a person of color, as it will be and as it has been in one form or another, please listen to it. And please know that it is from that source that I get virtually all of my material. We will know that we have made progress only on that day when a person of color can get up and give the talk that I'm about to give and be taken half as seriously as I expect to be taken. It's interesting to see so many people come out to these events, because to hear some people tell it, you would think that this conversation was almost wholly unnecessary. To pay attention to the American political process and what the candidates for this nation's highest office have to say and not say about the issues that are of importance to them, and thus we are to presume importance to the nation, you would get the impression that the issue of race, that the issue of racism, that the issue of discrimination, and certainly that the issue of white racial privilege were non-existent issues, that they were of really no importance or very little importance, but not 1976 or 66, but 2006, which witnessed the highest number of race-based housing discrimination complaints in recorded history. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, the year of my birth, and yet it was not 1968 that witnessed the highest level of discrimination complaints based on race. It was 38 years later, in 2006. The research that was published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2004, which had looked at 10 years of excess mortality data for African Americans from 1991 to 2000, looking at the number of black folks who had died above and beyond the number that would have died but for their blackness, in effect, and the social and economic conditions that ascribe and essentially adhere to blackness in this country. And what they found in that study, which received almost no media attention, again, published in an academic journal, not read by the average American, not read by political candidates, read by doctors and people who research the healthcare industry, but that's about it. This study found that between 1991 and 2000, there were almost 1 million black people in this country who died, who would not have died had they merely been white and had the average healthcare quality and access of the typical white person in this country. Had they been living in neighborhoods like white neighborhoods in which the levels of exposure to toxicity had been as low as it is in the typical white neighborhood, as opposed to excess exposure to toxics, pollutants, etc. in black and brown spaces. Almost 1 million excess dead people, in this case black folks, who wouldn't have died had the system of healthcare access and exposure to toxics been equal between white folks and black folks. How is 1 million dead black people not news? You see, if James Byrd gets dragged to death behind a truck in Jasper, Texas, you will hear about that, and well, you should. If one individual is the victim of a vicious hate crime, you will hear about that, and well, you should. But if nearly 1 million people die, not because of bigotry, not because of hatred, not because of some white supremacist organization, but because of systemic and institutionalized injustice,